I am standing in King Street, and it is so cold my breath hangs in the air, and I can hear the bells ringing, and I know they are not ringing for a fire.
This is Southcoast Hack.
3 weeks from tonight, a man named Paul Revere will sell a printed image of what I am living right now. Blue sky, orderly soldiers, gentlemen in the crowd. The first man to fall, missing entirely. That image will travel for 250 years. This is not that image. This is what it was like to be here. But to understand how I ended up on this street, I have to take you back 18 months. To the morning 2 regiments of British soldiers sailed into Boston Harbor, and my world stopped being mine. September 1768. I am a dockworker. Boston is a city you can walk across in an hour. 15,000 people packed between the harbor and the neck. I know my neighbors by face. I know the streets by feel. And then the soldiers come. The 14th Regiment, the 29th Regiment, 2,000 men, their wives, their children, their camp followers, pouring into a city with nowhere to put them. By early 1770, roughly 1 in 3 adult men in Boston is wearing a British uniform, walking the same streets I walk, standing at the same corners. I want to be honest about something. The soldiers are not all villains. Most of them are poor. The army pays badly enough that when they are off duty, they look for extra work at the docks, at the ropewalks, wherever they can get it. And they will take less than the going rate because something is better than nothing. That is where the rage comes from. Not from a pamphlet, not from a speech in a tavern, from watching a man in a scarlet coat take the job I needed, for wages I cannot afford to match, on a street he arrived on 6 months ago. One winter of this, then another, and then in February it gets worse. February 22nd. A crowd gathers outside the house of a man named Ebenezer Richardson, a loyalist, an informer, not a beloved figure in this neighborhood. Someone throws something. Richardson goes to a window and fires his musket into the street. The ball strikes an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Seider. He dies that evening. 2,000 people attend his funeral. I am somewhere in that crowd, watching them carry the coffin through the streets in February cold. 2,000 people for an 11-year-old boy. If that did not stop this city, nothing will. March 5th is 11 days away. We don't know that yet. 3 days before King Street, the economy comes apart in the open. It happens at John Gray's Ropewalk, the largest rope operation in the colonies. Long, low sheds stretching a quarter mile. Woodlers stacked everywhere. A soldier from the 29th comes looking for work. A rope maker tells him he can clean an outhouse. The soldier goes back to barracks and returns with friends. 8-10 men, armed with clubs. What follows is not a skirmish. It is a brawl. Fists and woodlers and real injuries on both sides. The rope makers drive the soldiers back to barracks. The soldiers are humiliated, driven off at the place they came to for extra money. And humiliated soldiers do not stay humiliated. 3 days. That is how long it takes to go from that brawl to the bells ringing on King Street. 3 days. And I will tell you, everyone in this city knew something was coming. The only question was where. On the evening of March 5th, a British corporal stops a man on the street and tells him to stay inside tonight. The soldiers, he says, are determined to be revenged on the Ropewalk people. I hear this, and I go out anyway. The bells start around 9 in the evening. In Boston, bells mean fire, and men pour into the streets with buckets before they think about it. But there is no smoke, no glow on the skyline. Just cold air and bells and people moving from every direction toward King Street. I know it is not a fire. King Street runs straight to the harbor, cobblestone slick with snow, the custom house sitting solid and brick at the eastern end. Private Hugh White is on sentry duty alone in front of the building. A young wig maker's apprentice named Edward Garrick says something to him. Something about an officer who hasn't paid his bill. White doesn't take it well. He comes down from his post and strikes Garrick across the face with his musket butt. The crowd that has been gathering goes very still for a moment. Then it gets louder. I can see White back against the custom house, outnumbered and getting more so by the minute. Captain Thomas Preston arrives with 7 soldiers and pushes through to form a line in front of the building, bayonets fixed. The crowd does not go home. And I need to be honest about what I am standing in. This is not a crowd of gentlemen in fine coats. This is rope makers and dock workers and merchant sailors, and some of us are carrying woodlas, the same ones from 3 days ago. There are snowballs, chunks of ice, oyster shells, 50 people pressing toward a line of 8 soldiers who look genuinely terrified. Then a shot. I do not know who fires it. I am 30 feet away in the dark, and the noise, and I cannot say with certainty what I see. Nobody I speak to afterward can say with certainty either. Did Captain Preston give the order? His own account says he did not. Witnesses say he did. More shots follow. Not a volley, just ragged and unordered. A few seconds of sound and smoke, and then nothing. The crowd breaks. When the smoke clears, I can see men down on the cobblestones, in the snow. 5 men die from the shooting on King Street. Crispus Attucks is believed to be the first to fall. He is approximately 47 years old, African American, and Native American. Records suggest he was enslaved in Framingham, Massachusetts. In 1750, an advertisement in the Boston Gazette described a runaway named Crispus, about 27, 6 feet 2 inches tall. Historians believe that is him, though it is not certain. By 1770, he has been living free for 20 years under the name Michael Johnson, working as a sailor. He is not from Boston. He is passing through on his way to North Carolina with no connection to the Ropewalks and no part in the argument that started 3 days ago. He is on this street by chance. He is the first to die. Samuel Gray, killed on King Street, was in the Ropewalks brawl 3 days earlier, the same fight. James Caldwell, a merchant sailor, dies that night. Samuel Maverick, 17 years old, dies the next morning. Patrick Carr, an Irish leather worker, dies nearly 2 weeks later. From his deathbed, he gives a deposition saying he did not blame the soldiers, that he believed they fired in self-defense. His testimony will matter at the trial. 5 men, named, specific, human. Preston and all 8 soldiers are arrested. The acting governor removes the remaining troops to a fort on an island in the harbor. Within days, depositions begin. 96 of them, from witnesses across the city. I give one. I say what I saw. It is not a clean story. Dark, loud, confusing. I cannot tell them who fired first, or whether Preston gave any order. Most of the other depositions are the same, specific in some details, uncertain in the ones that matter most. The Sons of Liberty publish their collection in a pamphlet. The British military publishes a competing set. 2 pamphlets, 2 stories. The night is already becoming something other than what it was. Trials open in the fall. Captain Preston's run 6 days, the longest trial in colonial American history to that point. His defense includes John Adams, who will help write the Declaration of Independence. Adams takes the case because he believes the law requires a fair defense, regardless of the defendant. The prosecution cannot prove Preston gave the order to fire. The testimony conflicts too sharply, and the jury finds him not guilty. The soldiers' trial follows. 6 soldiers, not guilty. 2, Kilroy and Montgomery, guilty of manslaughter only. Their sentence is a brand, a hot iron pressed to the thumb, and then release. That is the full extent of what the law does with this night. 5 men dead, a mark on 2 thumbs. The rest walk free. A few weeks after the December verdict, I see Revere's Engraving for the first time. The sky in it is blue, daylight, a clear afternoon. I was on King Street in the dark, breath freezing, lanterns throwing yellow light on the snow. There was no blue sky. It was 9 in the evening and it was March. The soldiers stand in a neat line, a commander with his sword raised in deliberate command. That is not what I saw. What I saw was 8 men terrified, surrounded, pelted with ice. The crowd in the engraving is dressed as gentlemen. Clean coats, not a club in sight. I was in that crowd. I know what we were carrying. And Crispus Attucks, the first man believed to fall, passing through this city on his way to somewhere else, free for 20 years from a life that was not his. He is not in the image at all. I later learned that Revere did not draw the original. He copied it from another engraver named Henry Pelham, published his version first, and gave Pelham no credit. Pelham wrote him a letter. Revere's engraving went everywhere. Pelham's appeared a week later, to no one's attention. This image, not my deposition, not the 95 others, not the 6-day trial, is what travels. This is what people will know for the next 250 years when they hear the words Boston Massacre. A blue sky, an orderly line, innocent gentlemen, a clean moral. History is made twice, once in the street, once in the story told about the street. I was in the first version. I know which one you were given.